This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
It's Friday the 15th of November, and you're listening to the Friday Morning Break with John Gibbs on Teachers Talk Radio. The weekend is nearly here. My guest this week, Dr. Nikki Wright from Manchester Metropolitan University, with exciting new research and new research methods into something that has baffled human beings since the dawn of time: how to talk to teenagers.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
And as the music dies away, we're back with my guest this week on Teachers Talk Radio. It's Friday morning, and I hope you're looking forward to the weekend. And fascinating piece of research, as I said in my introduction, we're going to talk about with my guest, Dr. Nikki Wright from Manchester Metropolitan University. Nikki, we before we started recording, we were talking about how to understand the piece of research you did, and I think one of the wonderful things I'm able to do is to reach out to people like you who've done something interesting and find out really why you attempted this and what you were trying to do. So I'm going to characterize your research as research into adolescent communication, but that's the beginning point. And would you like to just describe what I'm going to not describe very well? So welcome to the show.
Thank you. So ultimately, our program of research is about trying to better understand parent-teen relationships in order for us to promote positive relationships and ultimately support young people. So what we're aiming to do is bring together the scientific literature, co-production, so with families and young people, so actual input from young people into our research, and advances in technology to really try and advance our understanding of communication, yes, and broadly relationships.
Yeah, and I think one of the fascinating things about your research is the technology. We'll get on to that, how you're using head cameras and things. We'll talk about that in a minute. Where did all this start? So when a piece of research like this is being proposed, how did you get the idea, and what's the origins of this piece of research?
So it actually originates, like most research, on parent-offspring interactions with mums and babies. So most of the research trying to understand parenting and how parents and children interact together focuses on infancy, for obvious reasons. So my colleague Rebecca Pearson, she actually started this program of work with mums and babies in a big birth cohort called the Children of the 90s, which is in Bristol. So most of the work on mums and babies uses observation to understand interactions. So you obviously can't ask a baby to report on their relationship with their parents. And also observations really, they lend themselves well to intervention because you observe actual sequences of behaviour, what happens in the moment, and then you can translate that into actually supporting parents and children. Whereas if you just ask someone to report on something, then it's harder to translate. So she developed this methodology and this question with mums and babies. So she had a big European Research Council grant to develop the technology and to start applying it. And then really we've come to apply it to adolescents because we know that there's this big mental health crisis in adolescence now. And we know that adolescence is a particularly challenging time for the parent-child relationship. Young people, due to the development that they go through, start to experience more negative emotions. And also they start to they need to develop their independence and autonomy. So it changes the dynamic of the relationship with your parent. But there's actually a lot less research in adolescence than there is in early childhood, and very little research using the kind of observational video methods that we use. So that's really where what we're doing now came from.
That's so interesting because I did come across that observation that there isn't much research into adolescent communication, communicating with adolescents, interaction and so on. Mm-hmm. And it struck me that, well, every teacher, and since we have a teacher's audience out there, mm-hmm. and every parent certainly who has had adolescent children will know it is an incredibly sort of enigmatic sort of time. I mean, it's not only culturally, I think, do we tend to veer between demonizing and fetishizing so adolescents somewhat in our culture. For a teacher, it can be, we have to tell ourselves, in other words, constantly remind ourselves, they are still not finished cooking, as it were, to use they're still humans in production. So there isn't much research into adolescent communication. So how did you start by proposing this idea and going ahead with it?
Well, so because originally Rebecca wanted to apply this idea to adolescents, and funders said, oh, teens won't do it. So that's a big part of why there's less observational video footage research with parents and teens, because the older a child gets, the more autonomy they have to say, maybe they don't want to take part in research, maybe they don't want to be filmed, maybe they don't want to come into the research lab and be filmed interacting with their parents. So the study that we've collected the teenage data on is a birth cohort called the First Step study, based on the Wirral that we've been following up since the mums were pregnant. And throughout their early lives, they came into our lab and we asked them to do a task with their mother and we filmed them. And once, as young people get older, you can imagine being more and more self-conscious doing that. So part of the steps to do this was, how do we best capture parent-teens interacting? And Rebecca, in her work with mums and babies, had used these head cameras that you wear at home. So you're obviously wearing a head camera on your head, which is a little bit embarrassing, but actually the kind of being in your own home and not having a researcher there observing you actually does allow people to act more naturally. So what we first did though was we literally went out into the streets in Bristol in a van, in a research van, and spoke to families on the street, showed them the head cameras, and asked, as teenagers, would you wear this? And we had an overwhelmingly positive response that they would.
Yes, I'm going to guess that. I don't know why. I'm going to make a cliched response here that adolescents like technology.
Well, exactly, yes. So I think that is part of it, and I think even though you are wearing a camera on your head, you are, there's not somebody there watching you as well. So I think the idea that there's this cool technology, and that you are in your own home, I think really helped us to get this data. So after we did that, we did this pilot study on the First Step study, and we asked, it's a big sample of over 700, but we asked for volunteers to take part, and they filled in kind of questionnaires about the experience of it, and most of them found it a lot more comfortable doing this at home, wearing these cameras at home. So they wear them during a task that we've asked them to do. We don't expect them to kind of just put them on and record their whole day. So the other part of the work talking to families and young people was what would be the best scenario, the best task to get them to do at home so that we could try and get at parent-adolescent relationships.
And anyone interested in this can look up online, as I did, and see some nice photographs of young people and parents and so on with these head cameras on, talking to each other. Mm-hmm. Does it also helps you to escape that problem with research of this kind, that having a researcher present with a clipboard, as it were, yes, changes the nature of the research? In other words, people don't behave naturally when they sort of have a sense of being researched. Did the head camera get away from that? Was there a feeling that this might create another kind of theatricality? They will, well, I've got my head camera on now, I'm being recorded. How natural could they be?
So the feedback that we got in the questionnaires was that they found it to be more natural. Of course, it does add an extra layer so some people feel a bit self-conscious wearing it. Some people think that it might be messing up their makeup, or they might just feel a bit irritated having it on their head. So it brings in another set of potential, and also sometimes frustrations with actually. So another thing is that we're not there to help them set the equipment up. So we had a researcher go out, explain how to use it, and obviously the teens were really involved in that, learning how to use it, but still there could be some kind of technical issues. So not perfect, but definitely the feedback in the questionnaires was it was more natural. And the beauty of it as well is that it gets these face-on-face footage, which you don't get from typically what we do in the lab is we have a camera up in the corner of the room, or we go out to their house and we're there with a tripod. It's the third person perspective. It's not what you see. So this footage, you actually see what your teen see. We see what the teen sees and what the parent sees when they're interacting, which is sort of what led us to initially focus on facial expression, because it captures these facial expressions.
So thanks, Nikki. That's given us a really good understanding of how you went about this research. After a short break for a message from our sponsors, we'll return to the discussion. My guest this week, Dr. Nikki Wright from Manchester Metropolitan University, and we are discussing some cutting-edge research into how to talk to adolescents. Join us again in a few minutes.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Do you ever wish you could sit down with other teachers and delve into the challenges and opportunities we face? Well, that's exactly what Table Talks at Bet UK is all about. Join small roundtable discussions based on your selected topics to share insights, learn from peers, and tackle the big issues in education, all in a sponsor-free environment. This is your chance to connect and collaborate like never before. Be part of the conversation at Bet UK in January 2025. Visit uk.betshow.com to learn more.
And after those messages from our sponsor, we're back with my guest, Dr. Nikki Wright from Manchester Metropolitan University, as we are discussing how to talk to adolescents and some very interesting research that's been carried out by Nikki using head cameras and technology that was explored in the first part of this discussion. It's Friday, the 15th of November, and if you're listening live, please message in any questions or observations or comments that you would like to add to this discussion. Now, Nikki, this is probably a sort of non-expert layman's view, but I've always heard most of our communication is non-verbal, or how you would measure that. But that's the thing I've heard and people say, is that we are intensely attuned to hand gestures, proximity, eye contact, and all the muscles in our face that we're reading when we look at someone else. So what you're saying is when two people are talking to each other, they are communicating in all sorts of other ways other than just verbally.
Absolutely. And that's part of what we want to do in our research, is really break interaction down into all those different components that you just mentioned, and how the actual content of speech is just one part of multiple different elements of interaction. And our facial expressions are really important in communicating how we're feeling and also our intentions. So if we're smiling, looking positive, then people know that we want to continue talking, whereas other more negative emotions communicate and that perhaps we don't want to talk, we don't want to continue talking. And it's really interesting because, as you say, we're not consciously aware of how much we're processing all these different bits of information, and we're also not always consciously aware of what we're communicating with our face. And there's definitely individual variability in that, and there's definitely spillover effects whereby if you're feeling frustrated about something else, or that could show on your face when you're communicating with someone, with your teen, and completely change the whole feel of the interaction and where it goes based on what your face is communicating that you might not even be consciously aware of. I think when we think about adolescents experiencing a lot more negative emotion, you can imagine how that may be coming out on their face, affecting how their parents respond to them, and influencing interaction.
Is it possible to sort of characterize what adolescence, this is probably not, what adolescence is in a sense, why their sense of the world and how they read it might be different from someone in their middle 20s or whenever adolescence starts and stops? I'm probably sure that's a bit flexible. But what is it that characterizes adolescent communication that makes it different?
Well, so there's just been this massive shift from childhood. So there's a number of different things. So because there's the biological changes, the brain changes that mean that there just is this increase in experiencing of negative emotions. And there is this increase in risk-taking behaviors. And then there's the cognitive development, which comes with this developing this ability to know that other people have different thoughts, opinions. Obviously, we develop that throughout childhood, but we've become just increasingly aware about what other people are thinking and so that it's the combination of kind of emotional and cognitive development with this kind of risk taking as well, and trying to establish from childhood, there's a clear structure whereby the parent is in charge and the child is not, and then as you become an adolescent, this is when you're expected to be more independent, and it's kind of just this reshifting of the dynamic in the parent-child relationship as well. And then obviously, as you get older, your cognitive development continues, your ability to inhibit yourself, your ability to regulate your emotions all develops better. And then by the time you're an adult, although when that point that you become an adult is probably getting a bit older.
Well, yeah.
I mean, your executive functions, your ability to kind of really inhibit and your behaviour doesn't really finish until you're kind of 25. So,
yeah,
hopefully, I did an okay job there of characterising why.
No, absolutely.
Yeah,
and I think identifying those some of those features there, the risk taking, the sensitivity to criticism and sensitivity to negative input. Really, I mean, we can all remember, I think, being terribly put out as adolescents by something that now wouldn't bother us at all. It might be, any kind of thing that would have focused on intently, and it became a big worry. And as you get older, you don't. I mean, now I know that there's a view. I mean, a sociological sort of view that adolescence was somehow invented in the early 20th century or something, or just after the Second World War. But it doesn't make sense that there isn't, and anyone who's a teacher will know this, that adolescents aren't, as I said earlier, aren't behaving in ways that they will later on. I used to teach sixth formers mainly, and the difference between the students that I taught when they were 14 and when they came to me as a sixth form teacher, the dramatic difference. And then as I taught them over 2 years in A levels, they would change dramatically. I mean, they were simply developing in ways. I was the same old me, basically, but they were changing much more quickly.
Yeah.
You mentioned one of the big issues for us as teachers, I guess, for teachers out there, is a crisis in mental health, which became increasingly apparent to me in my career as something which was increasingly mentioned, increasing a background there, and encountering more and more and more students who were suffering with poor mental health. Adolescence is when this tends to develop. In other words, you tend to see mental health problems coming after the age of 11 and developing and manifesting those. With this research, is that applicable to understanding that, or could it be?
Well, that's ultimately what we hope to do, because obviously mental health services are massively overburdened. So young people getting mental health support from schools and health services, there's a lot of demand. So ultimately, if we could help parents to support young people and try and help reduce mental health problems, support mental health that way, that is our ultimate aim and the motivation for doing this research, because there is this dramatic increase, particularly in depression in girls from age 11. So ultimately, that is what we'd like to do. And at the moment, we're just starting out, and we've collected all this data. So we have data on 150 families of parents and teens, and we're starting this process of coding the interactions using multiple different methods. And then ultimately what we'd like to do is we would like to be able to translate this evidence into interventions for parents and young people. So one of the kind of strengths of what we've done is that we have this face-on-face footage. So with babies, one of the kind of recommended interventions is video feedback. So you film a mum and a baby interacting, and then you show the mum, and it's very strengths-based. You show the mum moments where things went well, specific things that she did that went well, to try and encourage those supportive behaviours. So ultimately, what we'd like to do is use the headcam methodology for parent-teenager video feedback intervention, because it's so powerful that you can actually see what your teens saw through their eyes by watching their footage. And then you can kind of try and explain about these potential miscommunications, but also ultimately identify moments of strengths, like, the young person said this, you reacted like this. So ultimately that is our aim. And so that would be more intervention based, but also we could just kind of identify some general principles where we kind of think more in the moment about how we react in the moment to what the young person is saying to us, and try and understand why they might react the way that they do. Ultimately, we would hope to support mental health.
That's fascinating. You've used the phrase strength-based. So in other words, what you're looking for is not a means of saying, don't do this. That thing you did there, don't pull that face. Instead, what you're trying to find out is in the long run, and I've promised before we started this discussion that I wouldn't characterize this as researchers have discovered how to talk to adolescents. This is very much in its beginning. You're looking for a methodology of understanding how to talk to adolescents, as it were. So being positive. I mean, goodness me, as a teacher, I've learned over the years that praise and positive feedback works a whole lot better than negative feedback. But it's a simple thing to say that shouting at a class and being angry with them almost never works.
Mm-hmm.
Though sometimes you do it, but it almost never works. You mentioned the technique, so we'll just go back to the technology, the head camera. You get a scan of the face. Are we talking sort of use of AI here in looking at and analysing this, or is that not? What software do you use to understand facial expression?
So we do both human coding. So this is where a human rater watches the videos, and so we've started with emotional expression, but as we've discussed, there's many different elements, but that's what we've started with. So, I mean, in the 70s, Paul Ekman characterised the kind of 7 key emotion expressions, which are happiness, surprise, fear, anger, sadness, disgust, and then neutral. So there is a very thorough manual that lays out all the muscle activations that correspond to those emotions. And the traditional approach in this kind of research is a human coder watches that and painstakingly codes each second of the interaction, or of the footage rather. It doesn't have to be done in interaction, although it is in our case, and classifies them as what emotional expression they're showing. So we are doing that coding, although we're not using his the facts, it's called, because it's incredibly labour intensive, hundreds of hours of training. But what's also really exciting about what we're doing, and has been kind of interest to the press, is that we are using AI software, which has been programmed with those same muscle activations to identify those same 7 emotional expressions. So the AI software can do what would take a human coder hours in 8 minutes, and it's just the click of a button. And it codes it in so much finer detail. So it's every 0.02 seconds. It rates each of the 7 emotions on a scale of 0 to 1. So it produces an absolutely massive amount of data, which we obviously think about how it's the best way to use this data. But it's also so much more fine grained, and the possibilities of what we can do with it. So something that's really interesting that's come out of it for us is how well it characterizes mixed emotional expressions, kind of unclear emotional expressions. So one of the few, we're just starting out with all this data, but we've just had a student project where she's looked at teens whose happy emotions are actually tinged with a negative emotion. So where your happy face actually has some features of, say, sadness, anger, or fear, because we hypothesize that that will have an impact on how you interact with others. And we found that is actually associated with the teen rating a lower quality relationship with their parent if they're showing more of these kind of unclear emotional signals.
So they may be saying one thing. In fact, their face may be expressing in some ways one thing, but there's a clue to an underlying anxiety that there's. I mean, one of the phrases that came out of your research I picked up on was microcoding.
Yeah,
kind of pre-verbal, not pre-verbal, but pre-visual, almost before you can see when someone's angry with you. If I say draw an angry face, we all know what that looks like, the emoji of angry face. But before we get to those, this very, 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 as you say, subtle, instantaneous ways, and we're all very, very good at this. We have this tremendous brain we've got to characterize this. We've been training at this since we're babies, so we can pick this up very, very quickly. The unconscious reading of the other person's face.
Mm-hmm.
Fascinating. And another example, one of my guests a while ago was a Professor Rose Luckin, who does a lot of work on AI and education. And one of the ways she'd used AI was to look at teamwork and how teams respond together, and using similar sorts of things, using the way that teams communicate with each other effectively and not so effectively in trying to solve a problem by sort of, as you say, using AI to micro record what they're up to. So here's another example of AI doing things better than we do.
Well, we don't know that it's better.
Right.
So that's the next step, really. So it's certainly faster, and it can certainly provide this incredibly fine-grained detail that a human coder could potentially do, but it would just be so time-consuming. But it remains to be tested whether it's better. So that's our next kind of steps, to kind of really test it. So validate it against outcomes.
So when you set about this piece of research, what went well, better maybe than you expected, and what didn't work? Did you have to adjust it as you went through?
I mean, it's because of the process that we've gone through with this research. So we went out and spoke to people, got their opinions on using the head cameras. I haven't actually talked about the task that we got them to do.
Yes, please.
Whilst wearing the cameras. So because when we spoke to young people and parents, we also asked them, what do you want from your relationship? What helps parent-teen relationships? What do you want? And the most common thing coming through was that they want to feel understood. So the young person wants to feel that their parent understands them. So what we ended up choosing as a game, it's this commercially available card game. It's called Sust. It's kind of like Mr. and Mrs., if you know that. It's kind of where you answer questions about the other person to show how well you know them.
Yeah, what food? What's their favourite food and what? Yeah.
So the card. So for an example card is, what annoys me most: whining, waffling, or nagging. And then the teen answers about the parent, and then that generally generates. So there's obviously this kind of how well they know each other, but also some kind of discussion about it, which might reflect how well they know each other. And maybe there's a bit of disagreement. Maybe they agree. So that's the game that we asked them to play, because we thought it would get at understanding, it would get at more, hopefully at some kind of strength-based moments. And also, generally, people find it quite fun and engaging to play, because the other thing, because when we asked people what would get at natural parent-teen interaction at home, they also said things like, talking about our week, having a meal together. But the problem is sometimes people can feel that that's a bit forced if they know they're wearing the cameras and they're asked to kind of sit there and have a discussion that didn't just naturally occur.
Yes,
that might not feel so natural.
It's a bit like when your parents say, "We don't talk enough around the table. Let's all talk," and then no one can think of what to say next.
Exactly. Yes. So, but actually playing a game like that, which most people find enjoyable, you get caught up in the game. So it gets some good interaction. We also got them to hold their cards next to their head as they read them. So I would hold a card up and my teen would read it and answer it about me. And it just helps them look at each other's face. Because this is obviously another problem, that people don't look at each other in the face all the time when they're interacting. So if we want to get this footage of facial expression, it's good to kind of cue them to look at the face. So that went, so I mean, the game went really well. And I think obviously the fact that we went out and talked to people and got this input, and then we had a group of students at Manchester Metropolitan, so they're the 18-year-olds who helped us pick which cards would be best to use, and they tested them out on the families. So all that's gone really well, and I don't think we thought that we would focus so much initially on the AI coding, but it has worked because it didn't work as well with mums and babies, and they tend to be closer together when they're interacting. So the mum is often very close to the baby's face, whereas the kind of setup that parents and teens tend to sit in gets a better view. The data's been really good. So the AI, and obviously there's been advances. The software that we use is called Face Reader. It's commercially available, and it just keeps getting better and better.
Were you surprised by the amount of data you were able to collect? And is that a problem? I mean, you mentioned the next thing is going through this. I mean, have you got more, as it were, than you expected? And is your next question what to do with it?
Yes. So when we started the pilot study, so in terms of the actual people who took part, we got more than we expected. So we were initially only going to get 50 families, and it was very much going to be just testing out, how well does this work at home? Can people do it? Are people happy to do it? But because this sample that I've worked on with this sample for 15 years, my whole career, since they were babies, they're now 15, 16 years old. They responded so well. Lots of people wanted to take part, so we just carried on collecting data and got 150 families, which is a really good sample size for this kind of data. And then, secondly, there's the amount of data that the face reader software produces, 18,000 rows of data per participant. And so what's funny is that in most research using this data is that even though they have all that data, they'll just average it into big chunks of time and just put it together. So they're kind of not taking advantage of the fact that you could look at these really interesting sequences. So, because that's ultimately where we need to get going, between the sequences between the finding I talked about earlier in terms of the unclear facial expressions. That's just looking at the teens' emotions, just the teens' data. What we need to do next is look at the sequences between the parent and the teen. Ultimately, that's the interaction in the moment. That's what we need to be looking at. And we did have another student last year who did look at the data between the parent and the teen. So he looked at it in relation to the card game that they were playing. So episodes where the parent and the teen were agreeing and episodes where the parent and the teen weren't agreeing. And he was able to test some initial hypotheses about the kind of regulatory function that parents can play. That in the disagreement, so we saw that in the disagreement, parents showed more variability in their emotions. So, and there were more associations between all three. So we collapsed down the negative because it's not that common to have the negative. So we collapsed the angry, sad, and scared into one. And disgust is also considered negative. So he found that all three types of emotions, so positive, negative, and neutral, are associated with the teen being more positive during the disagreement. And the kind of interpretation about that is that the parent is kind of flexibly going between emotions and it performs a kind of regulatory function. Because what you might imagine is that showing negative emotions is not a good thing, but that's not the case. Because when you're having a conflict or a disagreement, then there needs to be some kind of negative emotion. It's actually, if someone's just completely positive when there's a disagreement going on, that's actually not adaptive, because we need to go through these kind of negative and positive emotions, especially young people. I think that's another kind of important thing that people sometimes forget about, is that we do need to show some negative emotion, particularly in a disagreement. And it serves, it's part of resolving disagreements.
Is that moving in the direction of saying to the parent, to the teacher, to the adult, that in a sense you're modelling interaction? It's a learning process. In other words, the adolescent is the feedback is involved in shaping your own ability to communicate later on when we are this finished article, as if ever that happens in the future.
Yes, definitely.
While you were talking there, you were saying people found this, or they're able to look. I have no idea about data analysis really. So how do you actually go about taking this data and saying we're looking for patterns? Was it using other software and this sort of thing? Or?
Yes. So there's much more complicated analysis that can be done that we haven't been doing. What we've been doing is specifying a hypothesis in advance. So we developed this hypothesis that unclear emotions would be associated with the report of their relationship. And then we pre-specified how we'd look at that and just looked at associations. It's quite simple, really. And then again, with this other analysis, they pre-specified, there was a hypothesis and we tested it with quite simple analysis. But going forward, that there are methods where you just chuck a load of data into a model and it pulls out the interesting parameters. So they're kind of more data. What I was just talking about is more theory-driven analysis, which is actually generally a simpler analysis. Whereas because we have so much data, we could kind of put in all these parameters from the data and try and get the data to tell us what the kind of important moments are.
And before we start to talk about some of the early conclusions or tentative conclusions you might have found in this mountain of data and how you went about that, it's probably a good time for a message from our sponsor again and the Teachers Talk Radio News. So you're listening to the Friday morning break here on the 15th of November with John Gibbs, and join us again with my guest Nikki Wright from Manchester Metropolitan University in a few minutes.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out! Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading!
Do you ever wish you could sit down with other teachers and delve into the challenges and opportunities we face? Well, that's exactly what Table Talks at Bet UK is all about. Join small roundtable discussions based on your selected topics to share insights, learn from peers, and tackle the big issues in education, all in a sponsor-free environment. This is your chance to connect and collaborate like never before. Be part of the conversation at Bet UK in January 2025. Visit uk.betshow.com to learn more.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
According to Schools Week, all three of Eton College's proposed flagship Elite Sixth Forms, run in partnership with Star Academies, which were to level up left-behind areas, are being reviewed by the government. All three of the 16 to 19 schools due to open in Dudley, Teesside and Oldham are part of a review of whether 44 planned mainstream free schools offer value for money. The government has so far refused to confirm which of the projects are affected. The three schools were originally given the green light last summer and were described as high-quality, academic-focused 16 to 19 free schools in education investment areas. The plans were part of the former government's Levelling Up white paper. An Eton Star Partnership spokesperson said, "The review does not come as a huge surprise given the current fiscal situation, and we intend to fully engage with this process," but that it remained fully committed to the plans, saying it would transform the lives of many young people across the country. The Department for Education said assessments will be based on whether the proposed schools meet a need for places in the area, if they have any impact on existing local providers, and whether the schools would provide a distinctive curriculum. In The Guardian, a report covers comments by Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson about schools' focus on well-being. Speaking at the CST conference, she suggested that schools can respond to declining attendance and an increase in numbers of pupils with SEND by improving the sense of belonging. She said, "Exam results open important doors to opportunity for young people. They will continue to be the anchor of our education system. But A-stars alone do not set young people up for a healthy and happy life. And where previous governments have had tunnel vision, we will widen our ambition." This speech came in the context of a wide-ranging curriculum and assessment review, as well as plans for a Children's Wellbeing Bill to be published next year. Phillipson went on to say that well-being and belonging hold the key. If we want to tackle the epidemic of school absence, children need to feel like they belong in school. She also argued that a sole focus on achieving is doomed to fail, because if we fall into that trap of chasing a narrow shade of standards, then children with SEND get swept to the side and attendance crashes. The curriculum review is expected to encourage a broader curriculum to be taught in schools, including music, art, sport and drama, as well as vocational subjects. FE Week reports on information from the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, which suggests government should replace GCSE Maths resits with a new foundation level course, after warning the bar is unachievably high for some students to pass the GCSE. In the report, it says research found England's share of young people studying maths up to the age of 18 is among the lowest in the OECD's 38 member countries, in part due to a limited range of options for continuing the subject in post-16 settings. The study found that at least half of students study maths to 18 across OECD member countries, compared with just 16.5% of students in England, and a third of those were those who did not have a grade 4 at GCSE. The report suggests that the breadth and depth of maths GCSE is comparable to other programmes across the OECD, but the England students are younger when they take the course and have just 2 years to cover content compared to 4 in other countries. The report finally recommended that policymakers review and consider a foundation level course for those who do not achieve a grade 4 at GCSE, to ensure that they can continue their core mathematical knowledge and skills, replacing the GCSE reset altogether. Finally, the BBC reports that a 17-year-old Chinese maths prodigy actually cheated in a maths contest, according to its organisers. The student made headlines in June when she came 12th in the qualifiers for the contest run by the e-commerce company Alibaba. She was the first finalist since 2018 to have come from a vocational school, as the vast majority of past finalists have come from elite universities. However, competition organisers said the student had violated competition rules by receiving help from her teacher, who was also a contestant. The story has prompted debate about whether China's education system does enough to support gifted students in less academic pathways, as well as the pressures all students and teachers face. Full details can be found on the BBC News Asia webpage. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
And that was the Teachers Talk Radio News read and compiled by the wonderful Joe Fox. It's Friday the 15th of November and the weather's turning cold, or at least it will be next week. And Christmas is not far away. This week on Teachers Talk Radio, on the Friday morning break with me, John Gibbs, we've been talking to Dr. Nikki Wright from Manchester Metropolitan University, and we've been discussing communication between parents and adolescents, an innovative new research that's being conducted by Manchester Met. Was there anything that you found that in that way, that you said, well, I believe this is true about adolescents, that you found something you didn't expect? In other words, there was hypotheses that, well, I'm sure this is true, and it turned out not to be the case.
We're so early on that we've not done much analysis. I mean, something that is quite interesting is that what's typically found is that girls show more positive emotions. And that's the same in our data. Girls show more happiness and surprise than boys do. Yet we know that girls have kind of 3 to 4 times the rates of depression that boys do. So it is interesting to think about how much of the emotion we express is our actual feelings versus kind of social intentions. And we know that girls are generally more interpersonally orientated and more tend to be more, social interaction generally is more important for females. So I think that's quite interesting that, we know that more girls will be experiencing more negative emotions, but that's not showing up in their emotional expressions.
That is interesting, isn't it? I mean, as a parent of 2 daughters and having taught mixed classes over the years, it seems to be a truism that girls talk more, girls discuss things more, and boys don't so much. Mm-hmm. And yet that should be good, shouldn't it? That should create greater mental stability, health and validation and so on. So there's something going on there. If the 2 things are both true, that girls communicate more with each other and share emotions more and so forth and give each other greater feedback, and yet at the same time there's a higher level of depression. Yeah. So that's a direction you could go in to find out more about that.
Yes, I mean this issue with such high rates of depression in adolescent females is something we still don't fully understand.
Yes. Anyone listening to this is probably shouting something like, well, it's the internet, it's Facebook, it's all those things, and Snapchat and God knows what. So but your research isn't about that. It's about, in other words, there's a probably one of the things that also might observe in this kind of research is cultural changes in the cultural context. It's going to be different in different places, different over different time. So how long is this piece of these conclusions, how long could they be valid, given that our society is continually changing, and whatever Facebook is today, something else will be even more extraordinary tomorrow? How do we I mean, in other words, how are conclusions like this going to last?
Well, I mean, we have just collected this data. A lot of the data sets that are getting published on now, the data was collected quite some time ago. You think about how much things have changed. So you're right that society keeps changing, and it's a question though how much will that affect FACE on the fact that we now conduct a lot of our interactions online over messages, maybe over video chat. Does that mean that our face-to-face interactions with our parents when we do have them are different, or will they always be the same? There's just a bit less of them. So these are questions that we need to ask, I guess, as to whether it will be applicable. But I would imagine that the face-to-face interaction that we have with our parents, which is what we're looking at in this case, will probably remain fairly similar.
So it's probably that what we're looking at is something fairly universal, that if we were able to jump in a time machine and observe a Victorian parent, there may be all sorts of values and differences and so on, but we'd recognise some universals. This is the way.
So. It's very difficult to test that, but...
Oh, yeah. No, time machine, that's the next bit of tech. You're listening to Teachers Talk Radio on this Friday morning, the 15th of November. If you have any questions, please send them in, message them in to me in the studio this morning on the Friday morning break. My guest, Dr. Nikki Wright. We are discussing adolescent communication with adults. One of the things that did strike me, jumped out of the research, was the observation that, surprisingly, as most people think, adolescence isn't a period of time when you have lots of conflict with your children. In other words, parents don't tend to find that they are... They were lovely at 13. I've come across this a lot, of course, in teaching. They were lovely at 12 and then they're horrible at 13. That tends to be not really true. Adolescence and parent conflict isn't commonplace.
It's definitely overstated. So the traditional idea about adolescence was storm and stress, that there was a lot of conflict. So it's definitely been overstated. It is a time that there will be more conflict because, as I said, the young person needs to try and become more independent, and they're trying to establish themselves as an independent person, and that's expected of them by society. They go to high school, they have to organise their own things, they can start to conduct their own lives more. So it is expected that they'll become independent. And of course, there's going to be some pushing of the boundaries. The parent will have their own sets of boundaries. So there is going to be more conflict. But I think as well, we do need to focus more that the parent-child relationship is still really important in adolescence, and parents still serve a really important supportive function in adolescence as well. Which is what we
I know that. Yeah, I know that the research is focused on parent-child interaction primarily, but again, this Teachers Talk Radio teacher audience. One of the things that many teachers will have observed, again, is another sort of truism, is that lovely class of kids who can't wait to answer a question in class and be very positive in primary school, their interaction with education will often dip, as it were, in terms of output, in terms of engagement with the work, when they go to secondary school. And we can guess all sorts of reasons why that might be. But would it be possible we could say in the future we could say to secondary school teachers, well, this is what you need to learn from primary teachers, or this is what you need to learn from the way you validate, talk to adolescents in this particular difficult transition time. Do you think that might be a practical output in the future?
So I think we probably can identify some kind of general truths about adolescents and how they express themselves and how they communicate that would potentially be helpful for secondary school teachers trying to understand what's going on with this shift. So they're just becoming a lot more, as you said before, self-conscious and interpersonally sensitive, experiencing these more negative emotions, and that's definitely going to be contributing to. And also this kind of need that they do have to try and push the boundaries, because that's how you become independent. And it's probably just coming out, it's not always done in the right places at the right times.
This research looks very much at facial expression, which is clearly, I know that babies, I saw some research where babies scan your face all over when they're looking at they intently look at you. And we're from very early on learning how to communicate looking at people's faces. Does it look at the context in terms of of hand gestures and proximity and what's on the wall behind you and all the sorts of things that might be distracting? I mean, another debate in teaching is classrooms that are very sparse are actually better places to teach than classes that are very loaded with things on the wall and like I've got behind me maps and things. that kind of environment's a bit overstimulating. Was there a difference? And you say, right, this context works better for communication.
Yes, so I've talked today about in terms of the interaction, I've talked today about facial expression because that's what we started with and already have reams of data. But yes, we are actually exploring coding body positioning next. So that might be hand gestures, but even just the positioning of our shoulders kind of communicates our intentions in an interaction. And then ultimately tone of voice and the speech will code all those things. Obviously, we're very focused on the interaction and less on what's kind of going on around, like what's in the background. I know there's massive individual differences in people, how much they even notice what's going on in the background. So I can certainly imagine for some young people, it's definitely distracting to have a lot going on in the background. But that could be an interesting point, thinking if too much information, so too much going on across different domains is overwhelming for some people, or is it, more stimulating? And what about if those different indices of behavior or whatever of input are not matched, so they're conflicting, and there's so many different. Once you start adding in the other bit, it gets really complicated, and people definitely have individual differences in. So some people are very sensitive to proximity and don't like people in their personal space. There's all sorts of individual differences that overlay it as well.
Yes, that kind of teacher that we can all remember who, in order to make a point, got very close to you. I remember it now. And that I can imagine that at sort of 3 a.m, a researcher such as yourself wakes up thinking, there's all too much. This is as the understanding of things expands into what should we look at next? And in the end, you've just studied every aspect of human existence.
Yes. Part of the AI is asking, what might be, how much can we do with can we learn a lot from one thing, what can we do with facial expression? Imagine if we could actually have some impactful findings and kind of develop interventions based on just facial expression. That would be great. But will it be that simple? We definitely need to look at the more complex pattern across different behaviors.
Yes. As this research develops and you go on to next stages and so on, how does it reach the counsellors, the teachers, the parents in the future? Where eventually does this evolve into something that is a practical, useful guidelines or something? How does that process take place?
I mean, we would love to actually have impact with our research, which is what all researchers do want. It can just be tricky. So the first step is we have to kind of validate what we're finding. So by doing that, we have to show that these interactional patterns that we identify are associated with meaningful outcomes, like lower depression in adolescence, or, subjective report by the young person or the parent of a better supportive relationship. So that's the first step. We kind of identify these relational features, interactional patterns, whatever they are, and validate them against meaningful outcomes. And then, as I said, Rebecca Pearson's very keen to develop this video feedback intervention, which we would then like to get rolled out in clinical practice. And I do think that we could develop some kind of broader guidelines as well, just to try and help us, because obviously we can't roll out video intervention with everyone. That's going to be quite, on a smaller group, but kind of general principles about just being a bit more aware in the moment about what you're communicating to someone else, how your face, how your body, how the tone of your voice is communicating something to the person you're interacting with, and how that might be affecting your interaction. So much happens in the moment that we're not even really aware of, are we? And if we step back and try and be a bit more aware of what's going right and what's going wrong in an interaction, then that could be beneficial for all sorts of groups of people.
So I can imagine in the future this being the head camera and so on being useful in a clinical situation, or one day evolving into a module in teacher training.
Perhaps, yeah.
Effective communication and so on might come out that way.
Well, yes, because it could be used as kind of a training exercise for you as teachers. When you see yourself back in a scenario and just get that awareness of how you might be coming across. And a lot of it is just individual differences in how we express ourselves. So you can't see me, but I'm very smiley, very expressive. It actually makes me cringe when I see a video back of myself because it doesn't seem genuine because I'm so smiley. Whereas other people, it's just naturally less, they show, naturally less positive emotions, and kind of having that awareness about yourself.
Yes. I have had the experience for over a couple of times where they've put a camera at the back of the classroom when I've been teaching. And I've thought, if the students were going to mock me, it would be for this thing that I keep doing.
Yeah.
I didn't realize I did this all the time, or some hand gesture. When one point in my career, my daughter came to the school where I taught, and she did an A-level that I taught. So I was her teacher. And she said, Dad, you always, every time you're going to make a point, you put your hand on the board like this and leave a fingerprint mark. Don't do that. What do you mean don't do that? She said, look at the board after the lessons. They're all covered in little fingerprint marks that you're touching. Yeah, so that was a bit of feedback. I'm not sure what I did with that feedback, but it was...
No.
And of course, as you say, I'm looking at an image of myself here in this camera, and I guess I'm thinking, well, what does a raised eyebrow and so on? What does that? What might be doing with that? We may be more conscious in a more visual age. We certainly see ourselves more than just in mirrors these days.
Oh, definitely, especially young people, constantly taking pictures of themselves and video chat. It is interesting.
We're super conscious of our own image, much more than I would hate to be. Goodness me. And a mirror was bad enough in the 1970s. Today, this would be quite a nightmare. Well, this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. I'd love to come back to you at some point in the future and say, where's this gone? What have you now found out, as it were? Because the pursuit of this understanding seems to me to be fascinating. Where it's going could be even more so. Dr. Nikki Wright, thank you so much for joining me this morning on Teachers Talk Radio. It's been a privilege and lovely to hear about what you're studying and finding out.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me.
And you've been listening to a discussion between myself, John Gibbs, and Dr. Nikki Wright of Manchester Metropolitan University, here on Teachers Talk Radio on Friday the 15th of November. I hope you enjoyed our discussion. I think I learned a lot, and in my ongoing quest to understand what schools are for, I think I may have had an insight, even though this did seem to be rather tangential to that quest. For a start, and this is purely my own extrapolation from Nikki's research, which is clearly, as she said, in its very earliest days, what I understood from some of those tentative conclusions, such as that young people are hypersensitive to facial expression in discussion, some negative, as it were, critical feedback is necessary, as indeed positive feedback is, and that interaction and communication is crucial at that particular stage in life. And I believe all this adds up to, and apologies to the researchers at Manchester Met who are far from making any conclusions yet, I believe it adds up to simply being authentic, listening and talking with clarity and honesty. Well, it would be no bad thing if that were the conclusion. Though I suspect it'll be a lot more complicated and an awful lot more precise than any of the rather hopeful and indeed rose-tinted conclusions that I've just come to. I think, on the other hand, researchers such as Dr. Nikki Wright are doing it in an altogether more objective manner. So it'll be fascinating to see what they discover in the future. If you've enjoyed this discussion and you'd like to hear it again, you can hear it on podcasts such as the Spotify platform and on the Teachers Talk Radio website, where there's an archive of all my previous shows, that's the Friday Morning Break with John Gibbs, and multiple other shows which explore all aspects of teaching, from teachers and writers to academics and experts, as we look at the world of education. I'll see you again, or at least you'll hear me again if you wish to, in 2 weeks' time. Thank
Thank you so much for listening.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.